Have you ever met someone who changed your life so completely? Someone who's your first, your last, your only? I met her once. Her name was Sheila. I worked as an engineer in China. My company hired me straight out of college and offered me a substantial sign-on bonus if I would relocate to the mainland hub. Apparently, the company was responsible for many of the dams across China, and due to poor upkeep, many of the lawsuits leveled against them had been for machinery failure. My job was to check the machinery in the dams and make sure they were working correctly. It's a pretty lucrative job. After a few years, I find myself nearly fluent in the regional dialect. An American is something of a novelty for the people in these rural towns. I often find myself invited to bars or back to someone's house at the end of the day. The women have been very amicable, if not right out flirtatious. I usually don't find it difficult to find female companionship if I want it. Well, I didn't, at least. That was before I met Sheila, though. I was checking on a rather large dam near the coast, one that filters the often polluted river water and keeps debris from reaching the ocean. The dam's been leaking something caustic into the sea for a few months, and it was my job to figure out why it was doing that. I won't bore you with the technical details, but it wasn't hard to figure out what was going on. No one had bothered to dump the holding tanks that collect the pollutants, and they were leaking out into the dam walls and then into the ocean. No one had bothered to tell the workers to dump the tanks either. So a week of work and one pumper barge later, the dam was back up and keeping the ocean clean. That was apparently cause for celebration. The dam workers took me out for a few drinks that night. The local community, heavily centered around the fishing industry, wanted to meet me and thank me. A celebration was held, and I was introduced to everyone from the village mayor to the town priest. The mood was definitely festive, and I remember being handed a small cup of strong liquor early in. The clear liquor was quite potent, and after a while, the night became a jumble of colors and sounds. I danced and laughed and ate some of the best food I'd ever tasted. The whole village was so friendly that, after a while, I forgot to be self-conscious about my height or my nationality, and just let myself be immersed in the moment. I was sitting under an overhang, a fourth cup of the strong liquor at hand, when I saw a goddess approach me. Her hair was pale, not blonde, but white, and her dress was seafoam green and clung to her. She had the eye of every man there, and had the ire of every woman. I remember thinking that she didn't seem to fit the standards of this place. She was tall, almost as tall as me, and her skin was darker, tanned, brown. She looked foreign, vaguely Middle Eastern, and I remembered thinking that she looked like no one I'd ever seen before. She sauntered up to me, her eyes promising things her body was more than capable of keeping, and extended a hand to me. "Dance?" she asked, her voice gliding out like a midnight tide. I reached out, shakily, and took her hand. She pulled me up, not easy to do, considering I'm mostly muscle and 6'2". As the music started, she began to spin me and pull me in time with her own internal beat. We moved as galaxies moved, a solar system unto ourself, and when I looked at her, I could see her barely contained longing. She desired me. She wanted me. And when she pulled me close, I could feel her heart racing in her chest. Her breasts pressed against me through the dress, and her lips slid up my neck. I heard her whisper something in my ear that sent pins down my spine. "Come with me. Come with Sheila." She broke from me then, a teasing finger tempting me away from the dancers. I stumbled after her, the drink and the fire in my nethers piloting me easily. Did you say Sheila? Is that your name?" I slurred, letting her lead me towards the beach. She smiled and kept crooking her finger at me as we left the festivities. She led me through the sprawl of the little dwellings that butted up against the sea, and in my drunken state, I was in no mood to think about what I might be doing. Her pale hair danced in the moonlight, and her tan skin shone so pale it was almost white. It turned her into a ghost, floating along before me as I stumbled on the rutted path. She beckoned me onward, and as I came, I could hear some exotic melody floating around us in the air. Then the dog began to bark, and the melody was snatched away. He wasn't much of a guard dog, some little mutt that had been tied up in someone's yard, but the effect he had on her was jarring. She recoiled as though she had been burned, and took a few shaky steps away from the animal. The dog was lunging at her, straining against its rope and snarling like a wild thing. He was choking himself trying to get free, and his aggressive behavior seemed aimed solely at my companion. Watching him maul the air was starting to bring me out of my daze. Then Sheila rounded on him and hissing at him like a scalded cat. The dog yarked and backpedaled to hunker under the porch, completely chastised. When she crooked her finger at me, the lovely music began to take me away again. We came to the beach, and she led me to a spot behind a stand of vegetation. There sat a hand-carved wooden boat bobbing in the surf. As I climbed inside, I felt the weight of the drink descend on me. I closed my eyes and felt the boat slip off into the waves. My fingers splashed into the spray when they took to the water, and I remember thinking that we were moving much too fast for a boat she was paddling. I'd seen no motor, and the boat looked like the kind that you would need big oars and strong arms to pilot. As we bobbed and floated in the churning soup, I let my mind focus on the strange music enveloping me, and drifted off for what couldn't have been longer than a few minutes. When I awoke, we were on a very different stretch of sand, and her hands were pressed against my chest, her face very close to mine. She smiled when she saw that I was awake. "Come," she whispered, and was off me and out of the boat with a cat-like grace. I rose from the boat much less gracefully, and as I looked across the water, I could see the lights of the little fishing village many miles away. I looked for the oars, but I didn't see them. I must have been out for hours, because there was no way she could have gone that far in a few minutes. The little boat bobbed in the shallows, having no anchor and no means to stay put either, and that confused me as well. Surely the tide must take it back out again without something to tie it down. Then the warm laughter of my guide and the soft music enveloped me again, and I followed her into the woods. A lush jungle lay not far from the boat, and she was standing at the edge and looking lovely in her green dress. She moved into the tree line, begging to be chased, and in the light of the moon, I dogged her steps as my drink-soaked brain processed only the need to have her. The jungle vegetation was lush and thick. On any other night, I would have been hesitant to plunge into there for fear of snakes or poisonous insects. That night, though, I blundered in with wild abandon, and the deeper I went, the deeper I was pushed to go. When I crashed into a small clearing, a burbling pool splishing placidly, I looked around wildly. She was nowhere to be seen, but I could still hear the music, and I knew she couldn't be far. Suddenly, the burbling became a loud expulsion of water, and she rose from the water like a nymph. I must have looked ghastly myself, one shoe missing, clothes torn and tattered from my wild run, and my face awash with mud and sweat. She approached me, however, as though I were some Greek god. She slid her soft hands over my cheek and pressed her cool lips against mine. She tasted exotic, like oils and spices and something unknown. She tasted like the grave, but I wouldn't know that until later. She broke our kiss and slid her mouth to my ear as she whispered her last request. "Dance for me." I felt my limbs go taut, like a puppet whose strings have been pulled, and suddenly I broke into a wild and frantic sort of dancing. The music in my head changed, becoming primal and dissident. My body threw itself wildly about. My throat erupted in earthy screams of ecstasy. I felt like one of those ravers in a mosh pit as my body danced out its primal need for her. She sat back against a rock, her dress hiking up to show me a pale leg that I was sure had been tanned earlier. Hadn't she looked exotic before? Vaguely Middle Eastern? Now her skin was pale as cream, and her white hair seemed brittle and corpsey as the moon spilled across it. Her dress suddenly seemed more like a funeral shift, and the green became mold as her cat-like eyes stared at me in the throes of my passionate dancing. I was a beast, a man on fire, and as I danced, I felt my limbs exerting themselves to the limits. My legs gave way first, spilling me head first onto the dirt. I rolled over, my arms still trying to dance, and I saw her creep forward like something from a horror movie. She scuttled ghoulishly, on all fours, and my limbs refused to heed any of the commands I was giving them. My legs twitched, trying to dance but unable, and my arms kept thrashing and hitching feebly as she approached. I could see her staring at me from the soles of my feet as she peeked at me from between my toes. Then she opened her mouth very wide, and popped the big toe of my left foot into her mouth. When she opened her mouth, I had seen a double row of sharp teeth that promised to strip my flesh even as they bit through the bone. As the toe entered her mouth, I knew I would never see it again. When she sucked the toe instead, I thought maybe I'd been mistaken. Perhaps she was just playing with me. Maybe the alcohol had made me hallucinate, and this was nothing but a gin-soaked dream. Then she bit the toe, parting it from my body as she chewed with an ecstatic look on her cannibal's face. I cried out, but my cries mixed well with the dance's primal scream. No one would hear me out here anyway. We were miles from civilization. Even the fishermen on their boat that might be close would probably think I was a strange night bird. No one was coming to my rescue, and my body had betrayed me in the wake of the strange song. I was her plaything, her prisoner, and she could do with me as she liked. The other 4 toes of that foot went down simultaneously. She crunched them with relish, her serpentine tongue sliding out to lick the blood from her lips. When the toes were gone, she took a bite of the now oddly shaped foot. The blood ran darkly from the nub, and she lapped at it hungrily as she chewed. My throat felt raw from screaming, the pain intense and throbbing, and as she took a second bite, I heard my voice giving out from crying. She looked up at me, seductively enough to make certain parts of my body quiver, and began planting biting kisses up my leg. The wounds were red and oozing, her lips now painted in my blood, and as she bit her way up, I began to realize her destination. I tried to break free of her spell, not wanting to be parted from that particular portion of my body, but I was helpless before her. She kissed her way up my leg, her mouth splitting and the cheeks ripping at the corners as she prepared to bite through the front of my trousers. Then a dog howled somewhere in the jungle, and she cast her eyes fearfully towards it. She stared in the direction for nearly a minute, seeming unsure of herself. She was rattled. The dog's howl had put her off, just like the one on the mainland had. She stared out into the forest, eyes searching frantically. When nothing came running out of the jungle to challenge her, though, she turned back to her helplessly dancing victim. I'll save you the gory details. Needless to say, it was the worst pain of my life. I watched her throat bulge as she swallowed them down, a look of pure bliss on her face. My warm blood pattered down her placid face as she closed her eyes and basked in the taste of me. She looked up then, cat eyes searching, and I thought she might be seeing my heart as it beat in my chest. She licked the blood from her lips and stalked up my chest, grabbing my arms and holding them down fiercely, so my feebly swinging arms couldn't hinder her. Her mouth tore open at the corners again, and I closed my eyes against the oncoming rip of her 2 sharp teeth. The various wounds ached and bled, and at that moment I was almost glad that it was about to end. I just wanted the pain to stop. That's when I heard the howl, closer now than it had been, and something big slammed into her side. It knocked her off me, sending her squealing and hissing and driving her weight off of my hurting body. When I opened my eyes, I realized that it wasn't a dog at all. It was a wolf, a big black wolf with white snarling teeth and a pair of piss-yellow eyes that looked furious. My mind was a jumble. I didn't remember hearing about wolves in China, but I was far from upset by his sudden appearance. He leapt onto the woman and tore into her with his snarling maw. She hissed at him, slapping at him with her long nails, but as she showed some signs of driving him off, another wolf barreled from the jungle to join the first. As I lay bleeding, 8 of the largest wolves I had ever seen came snarling from the vegetation to ring her in. She looked at them. As her eyes met with mine, her face was full of fear. They buried her in a ring of ripping teeth and furry bodies. I didn't waste time. I dragged myself away from the clearing with what little strength I had left, making for the beach that had been so close when I had 2 whole feet. As I pulled myself away, I could hear them tearing and ripping at her, her screams driving into my brain like an ice pick. If you've never heard someone get mauled to death by a pack of wolves, consider yourself very lucky. I could hear them savaging her as I bled and crawled, and I had no illusions of getting far before they fell on me as well. I was leaving a clear enough blood trail and panting loud enough to be heard from the mainland. As the sounds of their feast became farther away, I began to think I might be allowed to die in the jungle instead of eaten alive by wolves. I had no hope of finding the beach again. I only knew that I didn't want to die as she had. When my fingers sank into the sand an undeterminable amount of time later, I drew them back in surprise. I had never expected to find the beach, and now that the sound of water engulfed me, I knew I might be allowed to die on the beach in relative comfort. I dug my body out onto that beach, my various injuries crying out as the sand caked them and was ground into them. I dragged myself forward until I could feel the shore's wet edge, and then rolled onto my back and lay where the water might slide up and touch me as I was dying. It was cold fire against my injured foot, but I didn't care. The sound of waves would be a perfect backdrop for my last few minutes on Earth. I could still feel the blood leaking out of my foot and crotch, and knew I had lost a lot of it. I closed my eyes and prepared to die, when my eyelids were suddenly blasted by a bright light. I thought it was the sun for one pain-soaked moment. I thought I had fallen into a pain-induced shock and come to the beach by day. But when the lights went away, I opened my eyes in confusion. The light returned a moment later, and I shaded my eyes to see it wasn't the sun, but a searchlight. As it slid away, I saw it was on a little ship that was cruising towards the coast. When I flopped back down and closed my eyes again, it fell on me and it held me in its regard. I heard people yelling, speaking in the native tongue, and there was a splash of boats being lowered into the water. I tried to struggle when they came for me, fearing that they were with her, but my body had reached its limits. I blacked out as the strong hands lifted me from the sand. The last thing I remember was feeling my back on the hardwood and wondering if it would be the last thing I ever felt. I woke up on the mainland, though. I had been asleep for 3 days. The doctors told me that some fishermen from the village had heard me screaming and come to see if they could help. My left foot was 60% gone. My left leg was in danger of needing amputation, since some of the bites had festered. My groin was a tube now. My reproductive organs were bitten off completely, and I was fortunate to be alive. Any longer, and you would have likely bled to death. As I lay in the clean white hospital room, being told I would likely lose my leg, and had lost the thing that, at my age, made me a man, I didn't feel so fortunate. The police came and asked me questions about what had happened, but you could tell they didn't believe me. The island I had been found on was private property, a nature preserve, and no one in the area ever went there for fear of the animals that lived there. They sounded like they thought I was a weirdo, some sex freak that had gone a little too far, and when I told them that the wolves had eaten the woman who had done this, they scoffed. If the fishermen in the village hadn't corroborated my story about leaving with a woman, they would have likely assumed I'd done this to myself. I'd still be in the dark if the old man hadn't come to visit. He told me his name was Lee, and he had been one of the fishermen who had found me on the island. They had left the party after his brother had told them who I had gone off with. He said I was fortunate to be alive. Many people who ran across the Sila were not so lucky. The what? I asked. Sila. They are old creatures that live on the island. They are spirits, he said, trying to find the words to explain it. Not like our spirits, but still spirits. They come from the union of a spirit of air and a human. They feed on human flesh and love to entice their prey to a secluded area so they can extend their time with them. You said creature. You mean there are more of them? I asked, horrified. He nodded. We lose men to the island sometimes. Many villages do. Like you, some come back scarred and broken, saved by the wolves who hate the Sila. You are very lucky, son. Never forget that. I lay back in bed, cold and wanting to throw up, thinking of others who had been lured to the island and devoured by that hateful thing. That was 2 weeks ago. The doctors say I will get to keep my leg, but there's nothing they can do about my situation below the belt. My company has offered to pay my hospital bills and sent over paperwork for a sizable settlement if I don't pursue any legal action for being hurt on the job. I told them I hadn't been injured on the job, but they don't seem to want to take any chances. The settlement will be more than enough to get home and start some semblance of a new life. I can't do what I used to do with one foot, so that part of my life is clearly behind me. So many things are behind me now. I tell my story not to elicit pity, but to warn those who might travel to this part of the world. Be careful who you follow home. That pretty face might hide some sharp teeth, and you might find yourself following your date back to her lair. There are Sila out there still, and I can attest that their hunger and their cruelty are not like anything you've ever seen before. Be careful, and don't be her next victim. I remember it like it was yesterday. My mom was at work, and my brother Daryl was watching me. Daryl was older than me, about 6 years, and he was kind of a jerk. Our dad had left right after I was born, and Mom had to work 2 jobs to keep us fed and clothed and keep the lights on and the roof over our heads. Maybe Daryl blamed me for Dad leaving, and that's why he was usually so mean to me. He was never violent, though I got the feeling he wanted to be sometimes, but he always teased me. He told me there were monsters in the basement who would eat me, and told me there were ghosts in the attic, that the boogeyman would come and carry me off some night, about all the perverts who would just scoop me up off the street someday and do stuff I didn't really understand at the time. He liked to scare me, and I think that's how we got on the subject of the Corn Man. It happened one afternoon when we were playing hide and seek. Daryl rarely played with me, not unless Mom made him, and he was being slow about counting, just trying to wait for Mom to go to work so we could go back inside and keep watching TV like he wanted to. He was counting, and I was hiding out in the cornfield where I knew he wouldn't find me. As he finished, he stepped out into the field, knowing that's where I was. He started looking, cursing, and stomping around as he couldn't find me, and seemed to be getting pretty frustrated. Finally, he said the words I will never forget. "Better come out, turd, before the Corn Man gets ya." I stood up. He had been pretty close to finding me, and asking who the Corn Man was. Daryl smiled wickedly, seeing another opportunity to scare me, and get himself back inside as well. The Corn Man, he told me, lived in the cornfields that seemed to perpetually surround our house. The field was filled with corn during this time of year, and Daryl said that the Corn Man patrolled it and got little kids who went out to play in the field. He said that the Corn Man couldn't see you if you stayed still. If you just stood like a statue, not moving an inch, he wouldn't see you, and he'd think you were just another stalk of corn. I told him not to lie, but he said it was true, and said we should get back inside before the Corn Man caught us in the field. We were both in the living room, Daryl gripping the remote and flipping through the channels, as Mom said goodbye and left for the night. He had spent that week tormenting me with stories about the Corn Man that were usually just ways for him to get out of stuff. "Corn Man will come into your house if he smells garbage. Better take it out before he smells it." I heard Corn Man comes to take away messy kids. "You better clean up around here." "Oh, you're going to tell Mom, huh? Well, the Corn Man loves to eat little tattletales, so go ahead and tell Mom you saw me smoking. I hope I'm awake when he comes to get you." That night, however, he just grinned as someone knocked on the door. He told me to go get it, and I prickled a little. I didn't want to go out after dark. Not after what he had told me about the Corn Man mainly hunting at night, and usually for kids who were out past curfew. He pushed me with his boot as I dithered, and I stumbled to the door as someone pounded on it again. My hands shook as I reached out, turning the knob slowly as I pulled it open. I sighed happily, though, happy to see Reggie and Clyde for the first time in my life. Reggie and Clyde had been Daryl's friends since elementary school. Mark was usually with them as well, but I supposed he must be off doing something else. They were often involved in Daryl's shenanigans, and I kinda hated seeing them come around. Tonight, though, I was just glad they weren't the Corn Man. I turned to tell Daryl that his friends were here, but he was already heading for the door, pulling on his leather jacket. He told me he was going out, and I asked where he was going after dark. "Not that it's any of your business, but we're going to go summon the Corn Man so he'll give us a wish." I felt my mouth slip open and asked why he would do that. "Well, in the story, if you can complete his challenge, then he grants you a wish. But," he said, turning back towards the door, "you'd better stay here. You'd probably be too scared to come out into the cornfield after dark." I agreed with him, until I realized that meant I'd be home alone. All night, but by myself. I had grabbed my coat and ran after the 3 of them before I could think better of it. The 3 of them were standing by the cornfield, cigarettes winking on and off as I approached. Clyde elbowed Daryl and pointed at me. Daryl grinned the widest I'd ever seen him grin, and the effect was pretty terrifying. He looked like a ghoul from a zombie movie in the cigarette light. Maybe even one of those pedophiles he was always telling me would get me. "Well, well, well, look who decided to join us. You trying to get a wish too, turd?" No, I said, snuffling a little in a mixture of fear and mucus. "I just didn't want to be at home alone." What are you talking about? You never said you got wishes from the corn man. Daryl took a long drag off his smoke, the light making his face look like a jack-o'-lantern. Well, the word is that if you stand in the field and say the magic words, the corn man will come and test you. If you can stand as still as a cornstalk, not moving and not being caught, he'll grant you one wish. But if he catches you, your blood will water his cornfield. So, sound like something you want to do, turd? I shook my head nervously, the wind rustling the corn and making me shudder. I didn't want to go out there, but I didn't want to stay here in the dark alone either. He snorted at me and rolled his eyes, pitching his cigarette away from the dry cornfield. Well then, go home if you're going to be a baby. The rest of us will get our wishes, and you'll just be home, pissing your pants. I shook my head again, and he must have taken it for acquiescence. Then come on, or don't. I don't really care. They set off into the thick cornfield, and I followed after them. The sea of stalks whipped past me as the 3 bigger boys walked in front of me. It was dark, the night birds and the sound of animals tuning up all around us. I was shivering, and it had nothing to do with the night or the chill in the air. I was scared, terrified even, and the jostling boys laughed and whispered to each other as they walked towards the center of the vast cornfield. When the corn surrounded us, we stopped, and Daryl turned to look at us. Okay, so now we chant the special chant to summon him. They stood in a triangle, looking at me, and I moved up to make it a diamond. Corn man, come to me if you can. Corn man, I can stand as the cornstalks can. Corn man, still as stone, not like a man. Corn man, still and quiet as the cornstalks can. He looked at us as he finished and told us to chant with him. As we raised our voices to the sky, I began to slur my words as my teeth chattered. I was terrified, standing in the cornfield that had been the setting of so many nightmares, and listening as we summoned the creature that had stalked me through those hated fields. Why had I come with them? Would I really have been less safe at home? Wouldn't I have been fine as long as I stayed inside? I heard my brother's words as he told me about how the corn man came after kids who were alone. They drifted through my mind as I felt myself start to cry. I chanted the words to summon the corn man along with the rest of them, tears streaming down my face as the fear took hold. When we heard the rustling, Daryl told us to be quiet. All right, stand still so he can't see you. If you move, he'll catch you, and then you'll be dead. All 4 of us stood as still as we could, the corn rustling as something came towards our location. I hoped that maybe it was the farmer that owned the land. He was a nice guy, but he didn't like people playing in his cornfield after dark. If not him, then I hoped it was some of the teenagers he usually kicked out of the field. Let it be anyone but the shadowy monster that was the corn man. He was like a scarecrow with cornstalks for hands and a mouthful of black teeth in my dreams. He would grow very high on his cornstalk legs, and he was faster than anything ever, even Jason or Michael Myers. As we stood in the field like idiots, I saw the sack head of a scarecrow come through the stalks and had to stifle a scream. He was wearing overalls and a straw hat, his face a sack with grease paint, and he was lumbering up out of the corn shakily. He had normal hands, but one of them was holding a scythe and the other was holding a hatchet. As he came stomping out of the corn, I held as still as possible, not moving a single muscle. He was real. He was actually real. In my mind, I had believed in him. Of course I had, but I had hoped that he wasn't really real. It's hard to explain, but some rational part of my mind knew that it was all just a goof my brother had come up with to scare me. Now I was forced to cower as we watched this terror hunt through the field for us. He moved like a wraith, silent and sure, except for the crunch of old corn husks. He smacked at the stalks with his scythe sometimes, and I had to stop my teeth from chattering as he turned to finally look at my hiding place. Until then, he had lumbered around like one of those adults that's only pretending to look for you. I felt like he knew where we were. He was choosing not to find us, and now the game was up. I moved my eyes around, not daring to turn my head, but I couldn't see my brother or his friends anywhere. Had they made a break for it? This was their idea, after all. Why would they run? Had the corn man gotten them? No, I would have heard that. They had abandoned me. Daryl had finally gotten tired of having me around and decided to have the corn man do his dirty work for him. Mom and the police would search for me, but they'd never find my body. I would water the corn forever. As my eyes rolled around looking for them, the sack head turned towards me, and the creature started stalking in my direction. I was speechless, utterly terrified, and as I stood like a statue, I felt a warm stream of urine run down my leg as the cloth hood came within inches of my face. I could hear his raspy breath beneath it, smell the air as he stared down, and I found myself wishing he would just get it over with already. We stared at each other for a count of 20 before the corn man blew out a raspberry of barely contained laughter and let his weapons drop to the ground. "Are you kidding me? Daryl, your brother pissed his pants!" All three of them came out of the tall cornfield then, laughing like donkeys. The mask came off to reveal Mark's stupid, sweaty face as he guffawed at me. They surrounded me like a pack of jackals, and all pointed to the piss stain on my pants and the liquid running down into the dirt. I felt the tears falling again, but my body was still locked in a rictus of terror. Daryl had tricked me. He'd tricked me again. He had terrified me and humiliated me, and now I would have to walk back home with cold, wet pants as my brother and his friends laughed at me. I wanted to run away, but my legs weren't quite ready to spirit me away just yet. That's probably the only reason I'm still alive. I saw Mark jerk suddenly, the smile dribbling off his face as something squelched from his stomach. It spattered across my brother and his friends, though they noticed it too late. I, however, couldn't help but miss it as it pattered across my face and chest. It was blood, thick and red, and they turned as a horror strode from the field of lush cornstalks. My mind hadn't done him justice. The corn man, or whatever he was, looked more like a terrible husk doll that you sometimes see at the farmer's market when Mom took us. It appeared to be woven together from corn husks and corn stalks and the silk tops of the plants. It was dirt and leaves and corn cobs and live plants. Its entire body seemed to move like a living vine. It moved with a complete form, its entire being, and it waded into Daryl and his friends like a force of nature. Clyde had turned to look at what had wetted him, and I saw that twisted gnarl of root and cornstalks slam into the side of his head. His neck audibly broke, bones poking out from his collar as he fell sideways into the corn. Daryl screamed, Kyle cursed loudly, and I stood rooted in fear as the corn man went about his work. "No way!" Daryl yelled, stepping back as he turned to face the creature. "No friggin' way!" "It's real?" Kyle asked. The creature momentarily stalled as it looked at them speculatively. No, I made it up. I made the whole thing up. It can't be real. It can't be real. It can't be." He died with that negation on his lips. The corn man extended his thick, rooted arm, and it grew as it coursed towards Daryl's head. Daryl's screams were cut off as the root covered his face, his throat bulging as it poured its roots and stalks down his throat. I could see his body twitching, his limbs convulsing as the corn man pumped his roots into him. My cheeks were wet again, my terror-fueled tears streaming down my face as Kyle made a run for it. He disappeared into the corn, just in time to miss the fate of his friend. Daryl's body erupted in a spray of corn stalks as they burst from him in a red spray of arterial blood. He crumpled, very dead, as his form was shredded. He lay in pieces, his body watering the corn just as he had said. I was resprayed with blood, this time being washed in the deluge, but I was still frozen with fear. My body had hit that point where it was numb, too scared to move, and as the corn man stalked in, I could hear my ragged breathing intensifying. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just knew that this was the time when my own blood would water the cornfields, just like Daryl's. He stood face to face with me, much like Mark had when he was pretending, and as the seconds spread out, I felt like my heart must surely stop, and I would die of fear. Then, to my amazement, the corn man spoke. "You have passed my test. You truly can do as the cornstalks can, and have earned a boon of me. What do you desire of the corn man?" I was speechless, my body unmoving, as I continued to stand like a statue before this hulking horror. His voice sounded like the whispering of wind through the cornstalks, and if I hadn't been frozen in fear, I would have shuddered out of my skin as his words hit me. He loomed over me, his body bathed in the blood of my brother and his friends, and I was left to shudder and shake as he stared at me. He cocked his head, his roots making a strange creaking noise as he studied me in my fear. Come now, there must be something you desire. Why else would you brave your death at the hands of the corn man, if not for a boon?" I looked up at him. Even hunkered down, he was taller than me, and my eyes streamed with tears, my body unable to move. "Very well. Know then that the corn man owes thee a boon, a favor as your people say, and he will be back to collect in time. Think well over your wishes, that my debt may be paid." Then he lumbered off after Kyle, his steps groaning as he moved, and I was left standing amidst the stalks. That's where they found me the next day. That's where they found me, and what was left of Daryl, Mark, and Clyde. I was catatonic for days. I had remained still as a stone in the field all night, not daring to move as the fear held sway over me. Even when they called out to me, I couldn't answer them. My legs ached, my body cried out for rest, but my legs refused to unlock. My mother's arms were warm as they wrapped around me. I was cold, hungry, my throat like a desert, but I couldn't move or speak. They kept me in the hospital for weeks, trying to figure out what had happened to me. The police questioned me ceaselessly, being covered in my brother's blood like I was, but my mother ended every interview by telling them that it was pointless to question me. They assumed that I had watched the 4 boys being murdered, Kyle's remains found further out in the field, and I had been traumatized by the events. I stayed like that for almost 3 weeks, before waking up one day to find my arms and legs were ready to obey me again. The police came back to question me, but I told them that I had blacked the whole thing out, not wanting to ever speak of the horrible things that had happened in that field. I only tell you here, a decade later, to come to terms with what happened to me and try to put it behind me. That, and see if anyone else knows of the corn man and his ways. You see, he's come back over the years to collect on his favor. I still live with my mother, my body locking up sometimes when the fear takes over. Once a year, on the anniversary of my brother's death, he comes to ask if I'm ready to take his boon. Sometimes he appears in my room at night, sometimes outside my window, but he always speaks in that strange voice and asks if I'm ready to accept my favor. Every time I remain still, my body seizing up and my jaw locking, and every time he goes away. I've gotten better at getting myself under control again. Last time I was only frozen for an hour, but I've had to go back to the hospital over the years when the catatonia reemerges. One day I will be able to ask for something, so I never have to see him again. Until then, I suppose I'll be haunted by the visage of the corn man. It's the little things sometimes. A good meal, a familiar song on the radio, a soft bed to sleep in after sleeping on benches or in sleeping bags for the past few years. The last one had been tainted for me after that night. I didn't think of myself as homeless. I had a beautiful house in Tampa, Florida, where my wife and my kids lived. I had access to the bay, a 2-car garage, a big backyard for the kids to play in. It also had my wife's new husband, the guy she married after our divorce, So, I'm not exactly welcome there. After the papers were finalized, I literally walked from the courthouse to a camping store, and after $400 charged to the credit card I shared with my ex-wife, I felt I had everything I needed to start a more carefree life. I thought I'd just live rough from now on, and to hell with everything else. I would ride the rails, take day labor, and just be an explorer in the modern age. That's what I thought of myself as, an explorer instead of just a vagrant. After doing that for about 5 years, I've learned a few things, and lost a lot of the crap I bought on that long ago day. I've learned which towns will ask you to leave and which towns will throw you in jail for public vagrancy. I've learned which day labor companies are willing to work with guys who sleep in alleys. I've learned the best way to get a shower and a shave in a public restroom without attracting attention. It's gyms. Gyms are the best for that. But above all else, I've learned that sometimes it's best to treat yourself when you can manage. That's what I was doing. I was trying to treat myself and get out of the heat for the night. I grew up in South Florida, so the heat is no stranger to me. I remember sleeping with the windows up, ceiling fan on, hoping for a breeze to rustle the curtains as I stuck to my sheets. The heat doesn't bother me like it does a lot of people, but this year had just been so hot. The heat was near constant, and I had rolled my sleeping bag up for the season and slept on a threadbare blanket on the ground most nights. I was in a rural area close to Alabama, one farm community with a short name and a small population. I spent my days unloading or moving freight at the train depot, and my nights trying to find a nice place to bed down. Sometimes I'd do day labor, sometimes I'd do odd jobs for people, but the police left me be for the most part, and I thanked them by not getting drunk and making an ass of myself. I was considering making this a regular thing, staying for a few months and renting a trailer at the Happy Acres Trailer Court, but then I got the word from Doris that they were downsizing a bit, and they couldn't really afford to keep paying me under the table. Doris was a sweet 55-year-old grandmother who was just trying to make it to retirement, and she told me that she was very sorry, but they were just going to have to let me go. I didn't really mind, I suppose. I took it as a sign that it was time to move on to somewhere else. Time to do some exploring farther north, maybe. It was getting close to harvest time, and there were plenty of little towns in Alabama or Georgia where a man could get farm labor work and bed in the barn or a bunkhouse. It was hard work, but it was good work. And I was hopeful as I took the small collection of cash that Doris had collected for me and set out on the road. That whole day, though, was the hottest day I had ever experienced. I hit the road about 8 a.m., and I was walking up the side of the highway by 9. It was the last week of July, and you could see the heat as it baked off the asphalt. The sun was high, and by 10 I was sweating as I prayed for a semi to come blowing past. It was little relief when one finally did, though. The air that buffeted into my face was like a giant exhaling on me. I thought longingly about the big fan running on the docks and how I could catch a long breeze between unloading and loading trains as I drove my forklift underneath it. By afternoon, I was miserable. My back felt like it weighed about 500 pounds, and the straps dug into my sore shoulders. I was in Alabama. I had stopped at the rest stop to use the bathroom at the border, but I was a good piece from Dothan, the closest big city. If I could get there, I could get some day labor, find a farmer looking for laborers for the season. I could even just pick up a job at a depot or as a fry cook or something, so I could afford to stay indoors until it was time to move on again. As I walked that first day, I even dared to dream that I might find something less temporary and make Dothan a long stop. I had grown up on a farm, picking vegetables and milking cows and taking care of horses, and the idea that I might get along with some farmer and become his stableman or his labor foreman was appealing. On the other hand, I was a lapsed accountant, too. I had worked for an office in Tampa and could easily get back with a place and make that my life again. I could get an apartment, have a stable job again, maybe even see my kids sometime if they wanted. Like I said, big cities are sometimes full of possibilities, and there's little else to do on the road but daydream. When night fell, I was squarely in the Badlands. For those of you unfamiliar with Highway 98, there's a stretch before you get to Dothan where there isn't much of anything but fireworks stands and little houses. There are occasional gas stations. Hell, there's even a really nice casino out there that no one ever goes to. But if you're on foot and seeing it through the headlights of passing cars, it can be a little spooky. The remains of abandoned houses that are slowly being reclaimed by the land look a lot like haunted houses when the lights of a passing semi suddenly bring them to life. The broken windows of a failing business seemed to leer at passers-by as a minivan screams away from them. The heat was still baking up through the soles of my boots, too, and I was starting to wobble a little when I finally decided to stop for the night. It was 8, some pink still on the horizon, but the heat of the 12-hour walk had exhausted me. I had intended to move over into the nearby scrublands and try to find some respite from the hot evening, but when the lighted sign appeared at the bottom of the hill, I thought it might be Providence throwing me a bone. Eddie's Discount Motel rotated garishly on a sign out front, and I could see a little neon sign beneath it that read Vacancies. I had about $200 in the compartment in my backpack, and about $60 in my left sock. Depending on how much of a discount Eddie's rooms were at, I might find a nice bed for the evening. As I walked to the bottom of the hill, I started daydreaming again, thinking about the continental breakfast, a hot shower, maybe some HBO before settling into a real bed for the night. I could check out around 10 and be on the road again, maybe even making Dothan before dark tomorrow. I barely noticed the hot tar under my feet, or the arid blasts that flapped my coat when the cars went by. I was on my way to something better, I thought. When the lobby door opened, I sighed in ecstasy as the cool air hit me in the face. The lobby was dingy, and calling it so might even be charitable. The furniture was of the bus station variety, and there was a magazine sitting on one discussing the first term of Barack Obama. My daydreams about continental breakfast drifted away, and I approached the plexiglass booth that housed Eddie, I assume, with trepidation. Eddie was a middle-aged man, his thinning hair pulled back into a ponytail as his Pantera t-shirt struggled to contain him. Even through the glass, I thought he looked distinctly greasy, and he looked up from whatever he was watching on his laptop with some misgivings. "I ain't got any spare change, pal, and I don't let people just crash in my lobby." I rolled my eyes, this sermon being pretty common amongst people who've never lived rough. Actually, I was wondering if I could rent a room for the night. Eddie looked me over and his glower softened. "It's $30 a night. Checkouts at 10 a.m. Cash up front. No refunds for stains or bugs." He tapped the slot at the bottom of the plexiglass, indicating that I could drop my cash in there. I bent down and fished 2 20s out of my sock. They were wet with sweat, but money was money in this economy. 30 was a lot to pay for a few hours of respite from the heat, but the thought of sweating out in the woods for the night had changed my mind. Eddie grimaced at the wet bills, but he slid them under the counter and flopped a 10 and a room key back at me. "Take room 5. Don't forget, checkouts at 10 a.m. And don't steal my towels." Then he turned back to his laptop and forgot I existed. The room was somewhere between swanky and skanky. There was a bed with a sagging mattress and some sheets that were only slightly stained. A bathroom with a shower and a sad stained toilet, and a TV that looked like it had seen most of the Reagan administration. All in all, it was a shithole, but it was better than sleeping in the woods. The only thing I cared about was sitting under the big window, and when it started pumping out cold air at subarctic temperatures, I was glad that I had shelled out for the room. The shower was amazing, but it was also the first indication I got that something was off. I left my clothes on the floor and climbed into the hot deluge. My skin felt like I'd stepped into a heat bank for a few seconds, but it passed as the hot lava coursed down my scalp. How long had it been? How long had it been since I'd had a real shower? How long had it been since I'd stood in a real shower, slept in a real bed, watched TV, had it all to myself? My eyes snapped open, though, when I heard the click of nails on the linoleum. The rings of the Dollar General curtain almost screamed as I yanked it hard to the side. My first thought had been rats. This place was slummy enough to have them, but I didn't see anything. The floor was stained, but my clothes were the only thing on it. I looked at the door, but it was closed. No rat could have squeezed under that thing. I pulled the curtain back and had just started washing the day's sweat off of me when I heard it again. It was subtle, like claws on the lino, but when I looked at the curtain, I slammed hard against the cold plastic wall. My mind was trying to make sense of what I was seeing and coming up short. It couldn't be what I was looking at, but I couldn't find any other way to explain it. The curtain was crawling with something big, something that looked like beetles. They were scuttling over the curtain, 4, 5, 7, 8, and as I slid into the ringed basin of the tub, I started hyperventilating a little. They were scuttling, their feet making the same clicking as they had on the bathroom floor. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel them. They glared at me through the curtain as the steam clouded around them. As the water fell on my head, I gasped in pain as the shampoo I'd been working into my scalp ran into my eyes. I wiped at it, not wanting to lose track of the bugs, but as my vision cleared, I was looking at empty space and the gauzy film of the shower curtain. The bugs were gone, out of sight, but not out of mind. I searched the room, probably looking ridiculous in my old underoos, but I never found anything. Well, except for the stains on the mattress. They were a little hard to miss. I had gripped the mattress when I saw the old red stains on the side. If you've never seen old blood, then you may not realize what it looks like, but I'd seen my fair share on the farm. This was old blood, probably years old, and I made a mental note to sleep on top of the comforter that night. There were sheets on the bed, but you can only expect so much from fabric. I put my clothes back on and tried to make myself comfortable. It was hard. Those big bugs were still fresh in my mind, and as I lay on top of the sheet, I couldn't help but wonder where they had gotten off to. Were they waiting for me to turn off the light? Were they just sitting in the drain in the sink? As some movie played in the background, I found my eyes staring into the corners of the dingy room. The corners were dark, despite the lights being on, and I felt something lurking there. I fidgeted restlessly on the bed as something scrabbled over my leg. I couldn't find anything when I lifted it up, though. I was being paranoid. What did I care if the room had roaches or beetles or whatever? Hell, I often slept next to dumpsters or out in the woods. Just because these bugs had startled me didn't mean that they meant me harm, right? Despite my better judgment, I got under the covers and tried to get comfortable. The mattress was lumpy, but not too bad. There was a definite divot in the middle, though, a person-shaped indent worn from multiple bodies over multiple years. It seemed to be my only choice for sleeping locations. It wasn't a chasm or anything, but it had an uncomfortable dip on either side. I finally found myself giving up and lying in it, and as my eyes started to slip shut, I felt the bite. It wasn't hard, a little less than an ant bite, but it snapped me out of my semi-sleep and made me throw the covers back to look. I checked the bed, the sheets giving away nothing, and I couldn't find any ants or spiders or anything. I thought about bedbugs then, and I pulled my jeans back to look at my leg. It was nothing, a little red spot, but as I tried to settle in again, I felt another bite. It was followed by a third, a fourth, a fifth in seconds. I could feel something on my skin, little feet running up my legs, and the bites were painful. I rolled up my jeans and swatted at my legs, but there was nothing there. It was as though whatever had bitten me had just taken a chomp and left just as quick. I was back on the comforter in a flash, but the divot felt tainted. I sat to the left of it, shoulder against the wall as I put my back to the headboard, wishing I had just put up with the heat. I could just leave, I thought. This was America after all, and if I wanted to waste my money, then that was my business. The thought of going back out and sleeping in the woods, the heat falling over me like a blanket, was not at all appealing, though. I didn't like the thought of bugs crawling on me either, especially not bed bugs. Growing up, my parents had been fond of keeping dogs in the house, and I could remember spending nights with fleas crawling all over me as I sweated beneath my sheets. We had bed bugs a few times as well, and I remember the sleepless nights spent as they crawled and bit at me. It had led me to be very neat, something that persisted even into my homelessness, and it was almost funny that I hadn't felt truly dirty until coming inside somewhere for the night. It wasn't a big problem, though. Bugs didn't like cold, and I had the AC set on about 65. I could sleep on the comforter, avoid the worst of the bites, and still enjoy a nice cool evening indoors before returning to the heat tomorrow. When the power suddenly went out in my room, plunging me into darkness, I felt a small moan rise in my throat of its own will. I was left with nothing but my own breathing as I sat there on the saggy bed. The curtain window provided nothing but a ghostly inkling of a shadow light from the parking lot beyond. I crossed my arms around my chest as I began to shudder. The cold air hung around me like a cloud, but it would dissipate before long. Then, well, I might as well have just slept outside. The heat was oppressive, but at least the bugs were a little less forward. As I sat in the dark, I felt like I could hear the scuttling again. It was clicking, the noises scuttling across my brain. I looked around fretfully, trying to see where they were coming from. I wanted to run. I wanted to get the hell out of there, but I just couldn't make my legs move. My eyes were roving in a panic when I saw the comforter begin to flutter. The divot made a little canyon in the bedclothes, and I could see something squirming up from that hole. They were big, looking like beetles from a kid's cartoon, and they came staggering up from the crater as they ruffled the comforter. They spread out as they searched for me, and I felt my horror growing as the waves began to flow my way. They were like a squad of army ants, making their uniform patrol as they looked for prey, and they were coming towards me. I did the only thing I could think to do. I got up and made a run for the door. I made a grab for my pack, but my fingers slipped off the rawhide loop at the top. I paused in the doorway, turning back to grab it, and that's when I saw them. The bugs on the shower curtain had been babies compared to these bloodsuckers. They were as large as dogs, their amber bodies clicking as they moved, and their piss-yellow eyes full of hate. They came lumbering after me, their proboscises quivering with anticipation. I slammed the door as I left the bag to them. I had a fleeting thought that I had left the room key on the nightstand, but that hardly mattered. I wouldn't have gone in there for $200,000, much less the $200 in change that was left in my travel sack. That's how I ended up running up the interstate towards Dothan with nothing but the clothes on my back and $10 on my sock. I must have looked pretty silly, but I didn't care. I was glad to be out of there, glad to be in the muggy air again, happy to have escaped with my life. And when the man in the Farmall truck came and picked me up a half an hour later, driving me the rest of the way to Dothan, I was glad to be able to feel the breeze that ruffled my hair. It felt better than Eddie's air conditioning ever could. Whenever I get the wanderlust again, I just think back to that night 3 years ago, and I count myself lucky to have gotten out with my life. It turned out that Dothan was some of the things I had been looking for, and others I hadn't even thought about. I found work. I found a place to stay that wasn't a park bench, and when the farm I got hired to pick pecans at was out of pecans for the season, the farmer was already having me work on his books to get him and his finances back in order. I moved into a little rental on the land, and I'm glad to say that my wandering days are over for now. I put this story here as a warning to those who still wonder, though. Eddie's prices may seem like a good deal, but watch out for the things you get on top of the bed and the TV. Those bed bugs have teeth, and you may end up as just another stain on the mattress if you aren't careful. Juliet, send in my 11:30. Yes, Dr. Winters. Pamela Winters sat back, tapping her pen on her steno pad, as Miss Janet Welch came through the door. She glanced around fearfully, looking at the small office as if expecting to see medieval torture devices. So many came into her office, expecting to see alchemic devices or sci-fi equipment, but Dr. Winters was a woman of science. She supposed, however, that when you call a place Dr. Winters' Forgetfulness Clinic, you had a certain expectation beyond a board-certified therapist in a cloudy gray pantsuit. Dr. Winters had 7, one for each day of the week, and Joanne kept them pressed for her, so they looked nice whenever she needed them. Joanne was a dear, and Pamela was lucky to have her. So, Mrs. Welch, Dr. Winters began. Oh, please, call me Janet. Everyone just calls me Janet. Very well, Janet. What brings you into the clinic today? Well, Janet said, biting her lip as she seemed to rethink ever coming here. Something happened last week. Something I'd really like to forget. Dr. Winters smiled. Well, that's why I'm here. Why don't you tell me about it? Janet shuddered, looking around as if she thought something might be waiting to get her. She was clearly a runner. Her arms, and what she could see of her legs, looked tan and toned. She was wearing capri pants and a lovely blue sweater, her hair in a ponytail that seemed very comfortable to her. Her face, however, seemed anything but comfortable. Janet had clearly encountered something, and whatever it had rattled her badly. Wait, don't you need to put me under or something? Hypnotize me? Put me in a receptive state? Pamela smiled. I certainly can if you like, but I don't have to. Can I offer you some tea? It's a special blend I make myself. It puts people at ease so they can tell me their problems. I don't really, Janet began, but seemed to think better of it as she nodded. On second thought, yeah, I'd love some. Dr. Winters got up and poured the tea from an ordinary-looking pot on a hot plate. As she brought the cup, Janet looked into the smoke before blowing on the liquid and taking a sip. She made an appreciative noise as she took another, the liquid steamy but not quite as hot as she had believed. She sat on the edge of the couch with her legs drawn up, looking like a child who's afraid to tell her parents that she's pregnant. Dr. Winters invited her to begin, and Janet told her of her strange experience in the woods. Janet stood upright from her stretch, filling her lungs with the crisp evening air. She loved early evening runs, the sun setting over her shoulder. As she began to jog through the parking lot, heading for the forest trail, she popped her earbuds in and hit play on her running playlist. Her sneakers sent up puffs of dust as she went from concrete to dirt, and Janet could hear the quiet evening conversation of birds and other small animals. They took to their heels when they saw her jogging towards them, and Janet saw a fat rabbit take off as it disappeared into the underbrush. She couldn't help but grin her Colgate whites at the cottontail. That's right, she thought to the rabbit, make way for the apex predator. Janet jogged around the small pond and shivered a little as she saw the steam rising from the water. It was cold this evening, and the surface of the water looked glassy as she watched the fish dart about their simple lives. Did they know there was a world above their translucent home? They must, she thought, since so many of them were likely to remember at the end of a hook as they were dragged above. She rounded the corner of the pond and headed into the woods that made up the bulk of her run. She stopped suddenly, though, looking around as she jogged in place. She felt something she had never felt before. She had run here for years, almost every day since moving to the area, and had never felt anything like this. Something had noticed her that was higher on the food chain than she was, something that saw her as a meal. Janet shrugged it off as she took to the trails. There was nothing bigger than a deer out in these woods, the only exception being the black bears that sometimes moved out here. They were mostly cowards, choosing to run rather than attack people, but Janet had never seen one up close. More than likely, Janet was just feeling a little tense after the posters she'd seen on the way in, and she pushed herself as she took to the trail. Most people were on edge after the man had disappeared near here, but he'd just been a hiker. He'd gone missing on the trail several miles from here, but there was no proof that he wasn't still alive. The state park hiking trails linked up with the Appalachian Trail in a few places. Who was to say that he hadn't simply decided to extend his hike for several weeks? The fact that he'd told his wife that he was going out for a day hike seemed to refute this, but Janet put it out of her mind as the trees leaned crookedly over the path. The trails were miles from here, and Janet didn't feel like she was in danger running on a public jogging path. As her jogging tunes kept her company, Brittany and Katy Perry pushing her on, Janet felt the woods close around her as she ran. She didn't feel uncomfortable under the watchful eyes of the trees. Quite the opposite. The trees were like arms that longed to hug, and Janet felt at ease the deeper on the trail she went. She had forgotten all about the weird feeling she'd felt before. Now she was back in her element, her strong legs taking her forward as her earbuds pumped her ears with the invigorating sound of her favorite exercise tunes. It began as a tickle on the back of her neck, the feeling of something akin to a sunburn, and Janet found herself turning to look at the woods as the trees whipped past. It made her uncomfortable, and Janet put her hand out to run over the spot on the back of her neck more than once. She'd thought at first that it might be a mosquito or a fly, but she never found anything as her fingers explored the space. She found her hands returning again and again as she ran, and it made the crawling feeling in her stomach feel worse over time. She had tried to shove discomfort down, but it became harder and harder to justify the deeper she went. Janet reminded herself that the trail was only 3 miles, and she was roughly a mile in. As long as she kept moving, she had little doubt that she could outdistance anything that might be following her. The path took her over a little bridge, and Janet stopped to look down at the water below as she covertly hit the pause button on her phone. The water was moving fast today, the little river sweeping the last of the fall leaves down with the current, and Janet let her eyes dart right and left as she swept the peripherals of her vision. She didn't dare remove her earbuds, wanting the illusion of being unable to hear what was chasing her. Something crunched in the woods to her left, and Janet had to stop herself from looking at it fretfully. Was it a deer? A squirrel? Maybe Someone stalking her, getting ready to leap out and grab her? She couldn't see anything in that direction, but when something rustled the leaves from the other side of the path, the side she had yet to go running down, Janet let her fear get the better of her. She swung her head in that direction, seeing a monster amongst the late autumn leaves for half a heartbeat, only to realize that it was just a crow who had landed amongst them to root for breakfast. She laughed a little, feeling stupid as she realized that she'd let her paranoia get the better of her. The crow looked up curiously, startled by her laughter, and that made Janet laugh all the harder. Then, something broke behind her, and she turned in a panic as her laugh died on her lips. She slipped on the wet boards, the moss making them slick, and as she fell on her bottom, she saw something hunkered in the woods. It was dark, blending in with the afternoon shadows as the sun set, and in her fear she imagined that some great beast was on all fours. Its eyeless face was lost behind a black halo, its hands like scrabbling claws, and as she slipped on the slick boards, she could see it crawling towards her over the dead leaves and skeletal limbs that littered the forest floor. Janet slid backwards off the bridge, her feet finally finding purchase as she took off. She ran flat out, her terror high as she put as much distance between herself and whatever it had been as she could. Her rational mind tried to assert that it was probably just a dog or a small bear, but she was having none of it. She came to a fork, one way taking her towards the hiking trails and the other continuing on the running trail, and she took the right that would keep her on this trail. She was a mile in, but she couldn't turn around now. Whatever it had been was in that direction, and Janet knew that if she wanted to make it out, she needed to run away from it. She had run almost half a mile in a panic before her lungs started having trouble pulling in the cold air, and she doubled over on the trail. As she tried to keep from bringing up her lunch, she looked up at the sudden claustrophobic trees that gathered around her path. No longer did they seem in a hugging mood. As the sun set behind them, the shadows created angles where there had been none before. Janet could see the knobby fingers of skeletal hands. They were trying to grab her, to hold her down so the beast could get her, and Janet tried to remember how to make her lungs work again as she heard the sound she'd been dreading and spun in place. The sound of limbs cracking sent an icicle through her heart. A deer had stepped out onto the path, clearly feeling safer than her in the waning afternoon. It had a magnificent rack of antlers, the points glistening wetly as it looked at her distrustfully. To this thing, Janet was the predator, and Janet took a step back as she gave the bucket space. She wondered if this was what she had seen earlier. Maybe she had startled it as she ran like a crazy person through the woods. Maybe it had just been trying to crop a little grass when she had startled it. It ran suddenly, Janet watching it go, and that was when she saw it. It had been no bear after all, just a man in blue jeans and a black hoodie. The hoodie covered his face, leaving his features a murky guess at best. His jeans were stained with mud and dirt, and looked like they might stand up on their own if he took them off. He wore cheap tennis shoes that looked ready to fall apart, and they were muddy and stained up too much to tell their original color. He had noticed her noticing him, and when his hand came out of his front pocket, he was holding a large hunting knife. Janet suddenly remembered how to run, suddenly remembered how to pull air into her lungs, and screamed as she pelted off into the woods. She had lost her reason. She had no sense of where she was going. She only knew that wherever it was away from this man with the knife. She ran into the woods, the trees grabbing at her as their knobby branches scratched her arms and face. They tried to grab her clothes, but the expensive jogging gear was tight against her skin, and the clutching limbs slid off her. She kept looking behind her, trying to see if the man was following her, but it was early twilight, and she couldn't see much. The sun would be down in about 20 minutes, and then she would be at the mercy of the woods by night. She had run this path 1,000 times, thought she knew the woods so well, but now she was hopelessly lost, running for her life. She chanced to look behind her, and turned back in time to feel the root grab her foot. She fell against the tree, knocking the wind out of herself as she went down amidst the dirt and leaves. Her frantic feet churned up the ground, rolling her over and giving her a great view of the man as he stalked in, knife at the ready. "Please," she wheezed out, her breath still gone. "Please." She tried again, but she couldn't make anything come out. Too winded to even beg for her life. How pathetic she must seem. So much for being an apex predator. The real predator had found her as she went about her day, and now meant to gobble her up. She could see the bottom of his mouth as a wide smile grew from it. He was stalking in, the knife still held down at his side, and as she wiggled left to try to juke around him, he jumped to match her. It was all a game to him, an enjoyable distraction, and now it was over. Now he meant to have his prize, whatever that might be. As he loomed over her, pulling the knife back for a stab, Janet closed her eyes and prayed that he would just kill her and not decide to stretch out her terror. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, Janet wanting him to get on with it, when he sighed in ecstasy. She felt something patter against her face, warm and thick, but cooling quickly as it dappled her cheeks and eyelids. She felt sick, her fear realized, but when she opened her eyes to peek, her left eye was covered in a film of red. The man stood over her, his hoodie now sporting 3 long rips in the chest as something pushed its way out. He had bled on her, his grin fading as he gasped out the last of his life. The knife fell from his limp fingers, sticking in the ground blade first, and as his legs tried to give way, he was pulled backwards by something much larger. The sun was setting behind the thing as it crouched amongst the trees, and Janet had to put a shaky hand up to see the creature. It looked like a toad, a massive toad with granite green skin perched on its bottom as it drew the man towards it. It towered amongst the trees, 15 or 16 feet high, its arms long and spindly, its fingers tipped with cruel claws. It brought the man back to look him in the eye, smiling as it saw the fear that it wanted. The man was seizing, shaking as the blood dripped down those long claws, and when the creature leaned forward, Janet could see its mouth was full of similarly jagged teeth. The crunch when it bit the man's arm off was accentuated by his wheezy scream as he shook violently. It ate his other arm, grinning as the blood ran and the hooded man cried out pitifully. Janet could only watch as the legs came off next, the creature finally ending the man's sobbing as it slid the dribbling torso into its mouth and crunched with relish. It was licking its fingers when it finally noticed Janet, and its smile was no less frightening as its piss-yellow eyes fastened on her. "Don't worry," it said, its voice like angry bees caught in a jar. "I have no intention of eating you." It slithered in, its body elongating as it drew close to Janet. She could tell now that it had been hunching before, its body much bigger than she had thought, and the knowledge did little to quell her fear. Its face came right up until it blocked out the sun, those horrible teeth almost hypnotizing her as they stared right through her. Janet felt her bladder let go, her running pants holding the liquid in as they held her sweat so many times before. She thought it would lie, thought it would eat her anyway, but instead, it just whispered to her in that hissy little voice, telling her what she had known all along, but never wanted to hear. "I only eat predators, only desire the taste of those that have taken lives and reveled in their end. You, my dear, are no killer. Hop back to your warren, little rabbit. A true hunter moves among these woods." Janet closed her eyes, the tears and snot running down her face in rivulets, and when she opened them again, she was alone. After that, I got up and managed to find the path before it got too dark. I walked the path, expecting that thing would get me any minute, but instead I made it back to my car. I drove home and sat in the car till my husband came to ask if I was okay. I couldn't tell him about the creature or the man. I just Told him that something had spooked me in the woods. I've dreamed about that creature every night, though, she said, her tears falling into her cup as she looked into her reflection. I haven't run since. Something I love that helps me deal with stress like this, and I don't know if I ever will again. Dr. Winters nodded. You had a very traumatic experience, but, and when she said the word, she saw Janet tense as if someone's hand had tightened a piano wire in her spine. I think anyone would be a little rattled if they were the victim of a bear attack. A bear attack? Janet said almost dreamily. Yes, just as you told me. You were running and came upon a mother bear and her cubs. Black bears don't usually hurt people, but she was just protecting her babies. She chased you away and you ran, scared out of your mind, as anyone would be. You ran all the way to your car and then drove home. Your mind has made quite a lot of it, but if you're careful, you probably won't find yourself the target of a mother bear again. Janet's face was slack, her mind reeling as it mulled over this new information. Dr. Winters wrinkled her nose as Janet's mouth opened and the tea spilled back into the cup. This was her least favorite part of the exercise, but it was necessary. That's right. It was just a bear and her cubs. Poor old thing. I never even stopped to think of it like that. Thank you, Dr. Winters. I feel much better now. Dr. Winters smiled. That's the idea, my dear. I help my clients put things into perspective. I help them forget their fears and remember that nothing was really as bad as they remember. Janet got up, handing Dr. Winters her cup. She looked about 1,000 times calmer than she had when she came in. This was the woman who'd gone running in the woods, Winters saw. This was the woman whose worldview had been shaken by her encounter with something far older and far darker than a mother bear and her whelps. Janet had seen something few people walked away from, and she was lucky to be alive. She would never know how lucky she was, but that, too, was the idea. Dr. Winter waited for the door to snick closed before taking the cup to the sink where she kept the small green fish net. This part was delicate, and she didn't want to lose it. Reaching into the cabinet over the sink, she took out a mason jar and set it in the drain before beginning. You only lost a few of them down the sink before you got smart about it. Tipping the cup over the net, Dr. Winter poured out the tea and strained the liquid, looking for the memory. The cup was heavier than it had been when it was full, and Winter just knew there would be something juicy at the bottom. It joggled as she tipped the cup over, and a large white rubbery thing fell into the net with a wet slap. It was a little smaller than a fist, the center glowing a little as it winked like a firefly. Winter tipped it into the jar, pouring some tea on top of it before she put the lid on, lifting it up to have a look. It was like ice as it floated at the midpoint, and if Dr. Winter looked closely, she could see the horrific face of the creature as it got in Janet's face and delivered its terrible proclamation. Dr. Winter smiled as she put the jar in the cupboard, several other colorful balls of semi-liquid winking in the dark space. Another satisfied customer. Driving is easily the most boring part of my job. I work as a salesman for an all-in-one printer company. Business has been slow the last couple of years, with the rise of personal printers, but our loyal customer base has really helped us get through these troubling times. That's why I was in Garrison and Marco's attorney at law that day. I'd been trying to sell them on the latest color all-in-one model to replace their current one, which was a few years old. They had sent me back to the office with a "we'll think about it," and I had started my 4-hour drive back to said office. That's how I came to be on the highway behind the truck in the first place. The sun was setting when I left the law firm. By the time I got on the highway, it was already dark. I mingled with the other cars as we merged in with the big rigs that made the interstate their home. I was behind a particularly large 18-wheeler when I first noticed the thing. It started out as a reflection. Have you ever noticed how an animal's eyes will reflect the light? Well, it was like that. I was sitting behind him with my low beams on when I noticed the sparkle from underneath the trailer. It was 3 or 4 small reflective points, and in my mind, I sort of obsessed over it. What could possibly be making those reflections? Some sort of axle? Maybe something ornamental that the driver had stuck under this truck. It probably seems silly to obsess over something like that as you sit reading my story. But when you're stuck in traffic on the interstate, your mind searches for all sorts of things to occupy your time. Whatever it was midway between the front wheels and the back wheels, too far into the truck for me to really make it out. I didn't think it was alive or anything, but it was a fun little mystery. I was stuck in gridlock. Some wreck up the way had brought us to a halt, and as I adjusted the radio in the beat-up old car that gave the salesman a drive, I found my eyes returning to that thing again and again. My brain just wouldn't leave it alone, and I began to create reasons for the thing to be under there. Maybe it was for stability. Maybe it was something he had put under there so people didn't hit the back of the trailer in the middle of the night. Maybe it was just one of those stupid things that people often hook to their trucks just because they can. Whatever it was, my mind had decided to obsess over it. I was watching it when my cell phone rang, and as I fished it out of my pocket, I found my eyes rising to see the thing as I said hello. "So, can we go ahead and put them down for a new printer?" the boss asked. They said they'd have to think about it, but they also said there's nothing wrong with their current printer, so I wouldn't expect to see any orders from them. Damn, I was really counting on offloading a couple of these to the firm. Did you tell them about the added features? Of course I did, sir. And I was about to tell him that I was no rookie salesman when I looked up and almost dropped the phone. The thing I had been focused on for the last 20 miles had moved. It was subtle, but when you've been staring at it for as long as I had, you notice these things. The thin fiber filament had shifted somehow, and the pattern had changed. I was almost sure of it. I could hear my boss asking if I was still there, and I assured him that I was. I told him I would be back in the office in a few hours, and he told me just to head home. I could turn in my reports tomorrow. Sounds like you could use the sleep. You're sounding a little jittery. I thanked him and told him I'd see him tomorrow, before hanging up the phone and looking back at the thing under the truck. I could also see 6 surfaces reflected back at me now, instead of the 4 I had seen a moment ago. They looked even more like eyes. Whatever wreck there was up ahead, they must have cleared it out of the way. We were suddenly moving along again at a brisk pace, and I was glad for the shift in speed. My mind had suddenly turned what looked like some kind of ornament into something dangerous, and I really wanted to be from behind this truck. There was no chance of getting around them, though. The traffic was still pretty tight, and I was pretty well trapped behind this 18-wheeler and the 18-wheeler beside me. So for the next 2 hours we drove, the most nerve-wracking 2 hours of my life. The longer we drove, the more I was convinced that it was no optical illusion. Whatever was under there was definitely moving, and it had quite a few legs that I could see. It was using 2 of the thinner ones to hold itself under the truck, and the other 6 or 8, or maybe even as many as 10, were anchoring it to the truck itself. What was worse were all those reflective surfaces that I still thought of as eyes. They were staring straight at me the whole time, and I began to believe that it knew I could see it. I shook my head the first time I thought this. I was tired, I had had too much coffee, and I was just seeing things. These were the excuses that ran around and around inside my head, like a dog chasing his tail. I didn't want to believe that I was stuck behind a truck, carrying a very different sort of cargo. I wanted to believe that I was just seeing things, and I was making things up to pass the time. That sort of delusion only lasted until the thing moved closer. You see, the longer I watched it, the longer it watched me. I don't know if it knew I could see it, but it didn't seem to like the level of scrutiny I was giving it. It was midway between the cab, watching me like a predator watching its prey. The longer it went on, the less safe I felt inside my car. Something that big could surely get through the window, or break the windshield, and I would have nowhere to go in this gridlock. But I was still trying to be rational, trying to be realistic. There was no way that whatever it was alive. It was a trick of the light. It was my mind playing tricks on me. When I finally got home, safe behind the door of my apartment, I would laugh about how silly I had been, and feel really stupid. I was a grown man behind the wheel of a car, jumping at shadows. I began to use this idea as a security blanket, wrapping myself in it so I didn't just go crazy right there behind the wheel of my car. That was when it moved. The reflective eyes shifted suddenly. I don't mean that they blinked or anything. I mean they shifted. One minute I was looking at it, and the next it was sliding beneath the underside of the trailer. Suddenly those eyes were coming closer. They were less than 10 feet away from my car now, peering from under the trailer at me as I tried to maintain my speed. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth. Whatever it was had finally gotten tired of being watched, and had decided to get closer. I felt a sudden stirring of primal fear. This must have been how early man had felt when it encountered something it just didn't understand. When it saw the long teeth and heard the growl of some unknown predator. When it saw the all too intelligent eyes of an animal that was a little too human reflected in the darkness. When it came to realize that the safety of its cave could also be a trap. I imagine that it felt just as helpless as I did now. Helpless, but intent on survival. I tried again to convince myself that I was being silly. This was nothing more than a trick of the light, some errant spiderweb under the cab that my headlights were catching that just now came loose and was presenting itself as some sort of boogeyman for me to be afraid of. I suddenly knew how to alleviate this fear. I would flip my high beams on. The high beams would show me the underside of the truck, and I could see that the source of my fears was nothing at all. I reached for the switch, my hands much less steady than I thought they should be, my fingers wrapping around the knob. For a moment, I just couldn't bring myself to turn the switch. Did I really want to know? Did I really want this thing to know that I knew? Once the monster in the closet knows that you know it's there, does it have any choice but to eat you? I shook my head and flipped the switch on. I know now that I shouldn't have done that. What was under the cab was no spider web, but it was the monster I had feared it was. It was a spider the size of a large dog. It was easily 4.5 feet tall, and it was hunkered beneath the trailer's cluster of wheels. It looked at me upside down, with its legs clinging to the metal, its fangs dripping some translucent liquid and clicking together very fast. It made a high, angry sound that I could hear from behind my closed windows, and the look it gave me on its far too expressive face was terrifying. My brain seemed to give me a choice between fight or flight, and in my cowardice, I chose flight. I pulled around the truck, pulling onto the soft shoulder of the road, and drove around it and the line of angry cars. Fortunately, there were no police officers in that line. There was an exit ramp not too terribly far from the truck, and I whipped into the on-ramp and pulled away from the highway into the small gas station about a mile later. It took me nearly 30 minutes to make my breath regular, expecting that spider creature to attack my car any minute. When I had control of myself again, I drove home. It took an extra hour, but I took side roads and backways the whole way. So often in these stories, there's a moment of horror that comes afterward. Some accident, a truck found abandoned on the side of the road, a dead body in the truck stop, but there was none of that for me. I never heard a news report alluding to anything strange or out of the ordinary. I could almost forget about it until I closed my eyes and see those far too expressive eyes looking at me as the high beams pin it to the underside and their lights. I take back roads whenever I travel now, avoiding the highway at all costs. I avoid big rigs as well. I don't ever want to see anything like that again.